So, good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. I hope we do find you all perfectly well in these times of health, social, and economic turmoil. What we need most to keep our heads above water in stormy weather is reliable, well-founded information. So, this is going to be our major task for today, to provide you with valuable information about the impact of COVID-19 on the regulatory environment in Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam as of today, focusing on HR and employment-related issues. It's our pleasure to have our valued colleagues Markus Schlüter for Indonesia, Christian Swoboda and Paul Weingarten for Singapore, Martin Krometzka for Thailand, and Martin Seibold for Vietnam on board as expert speakers. As to the schedule of this webinar, we will proceed country by country in alphabetical order. After each country session, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions via the chat option. These will subsequently be answered by the colleague in charge. Should there be any questions left unanswered at the end of the webinar, please do feel free to submit these as well. Please note that we will record the webinar and, provided the technique does work in our favor, we'll make it available online for you and your colleagues to recap anytime you wish. I hope we will share a most informative session and do now gladly leave the stage to Markus Schlüter.
Thank you very much, Bettina, for this introduction. Yeah, I will start this webinar today with Indonesia. Bettina, can you give me the next slide for this, please? So for the actual statistics, we currently have 5,136 confirmed cases in Indonesia of COVID-19, and officially 469 people have died due to the virus up until yesterday. These figures come from the Ministry of Health in Indonesia. There are not many other sources available to verify these figures. You may find the number of a bit more than 5,000 people being infected amid a population of more than 260 million in Indonesia quite surprising. It certainly is, and we can be quite sure that the official number is far away from the actual number of infections that we see in Indonesia. This is also seen by many Indonesians, and there's a certain discomfort with measures taken by the government so far. This is something that you also should keep in mind when dealing and communicating with your workforce and putting measures in place to mitigate the situation. So far, unlike most other countries in the region, Indonesia doesn't see a full lockdown. Jakarta itself now very actually sees a partial lockdown. Companies are recommended to let their staff work from home. It's now a very strong recommendation, but at the beginning of the week, we still saw that the commuter trains in Jakarta from the satellite cities around are still quite packed with people. Many offices are still open, and it is still subject to the employer to what extent they will introduce home office work or other shift works and things like this. In practice, staff is demanding, of course, to work from home office. So most employers who can technically ensure that people can work from home have done so already. We see many of our clients in Indonesia who have now enacted home office scenarios. Factories, of course, are not closed so far and still operating. There is also no closure in sight so far. The government has issued guidelines to companies regarding safety at the workplace, which are quite similar with guidelines we see in most other countries. They include hygiene measures, so there should be enough sanitation available and liquid hand soap. The facilities need to be cleaned properly and regularly, and staff should be separated as far as possible. But at least factories are still open, and also offices may still operate if the employers wish so. In case that the amount of work in a company is declining significantly, we do not have many instruments at hand in Indonesia as an employer. Unlike in other countries where short-time work is quite common at this moment, this is rather unknown and uncommon in Indonesia so far. Companies, employers may agree individually with each employee on such short-time measures, on reductions of income, of salaries of the employees. And in practice, we see that at least some Indonesian companies have done so already. They simply announced to the staff that salaries would be lowered. This is not in line with the manpower law, however, and most foreign companies are well advised to stick to the manpower compliance regulations that we have in Indonesia, under which salary reduction is only possible in case the employee expressly agrees to such a reduction. The same applies to annual leave or unpaid leave. There's no means, no instrument for employers in Indonesia, unfortunately, to force staff to take annual leave or unpaid leave, unless this is provided in the employment contracts of the staff, which normally is not the case. So there is hardly a legal way of employers to force the staff to certain measures to mitigate the economic risks that employers may face in this situation. The Indonesian employment law is very, very strict, and so far has not been eased in the light of the crisis. So if redundancy measures should be necessary, or staff should be terminated due to the situation, employers will either face the risk that they will be brought to the body concerning settlement of industrial relation disputes, which very often decides in favor of the employees, or in case the termination is then accepted by the staff, the employers need to pay the full severance package, which in Indonesia can easily amount to 1 or 2 annual salaries. So the economic risk for employers is quite significant. We have seen only very few measures in the field of manpower law at the moment. The most significant one now is the healthcare measure, which has been put in place by a circular by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Manpower. But other measures are still not in place. If an employee is declared sick and is deemed as a so-called patient under surveillance, he is still entitled to receive salary. The normal salary rates which apply in case of illness in Indonesia are further enforced, which means that for the first month of illness, 100% of the salary needs to be paid, which is normally the time under which a sick person recovers from the COVID-19 disease. So there is no specific way to reduce the salary under the provisions of the manpower law. But we see a very dynamic development with regard to other regulations that have been enacted by the government already. Manpower law, employment law is something, of course, highly political, and government is presumably concerned of large demonstrations in case the regulations are tightened now in unfavor of employees, but this can still change if the situation deteriorates further in the next weeks or months. And employers should frequently check whether there is any facilitation in the employment law. Next slide, please. Also relevant, especially for foreign investors and foreign workforce. We have now seen travel and immigration ban in Indonesia. It is widely restricted to enter the Indonesian territory, not even for transit. It's possible at the moment. There are only a few groups of persons which are permitted to enter Indonesia. Diplomatic staff, of course, is still permitted to enter and exit. Humanitarian, medical, and food aid support staff, foreign citizens who have a work permit and residence permit in Indonesia can still enter. They all need to be prepared to be quarantined for 14 days when coming back to Indonesia. So there are certain measurements to make sure that no potential virus is spread further in the country. We do not see specific restrictions regarding certain nationalities at the moment. The only instrument that has been enacted is a circular from the Ministry of Manpower, which entered into effect on 29th of February, which prohibits and suspends the engagement of foreign workers from China. This is subject to constant renewal, but still in force. So coming from China, workforce is at the moment banned to engage in Indonesia. This should also be kept in mind. Yeah, so much as a brief overview on the current situation in Indonesia. If there are any questions at this moment, I'm happy to take them now.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Markus. This is now your opportunity to ask questions via the chat function of our Zoom webinar. I will then try to consolidate the questions, and I may start with the very first question. Well, we have seen, as compared to other countries, we will hear more about very soon. Indonesia has probably not enacted a whole lot of regulations and measures. Do you think there are any legislative initiatives to ease Indonesian employment law? You have shown a picture of quite strict laws. And might such a process maybe be accelerated during this COVID crisis?
We actually see such an initiative, yeah. As mentioned already, Indonesian employment law is very, very strict and far beyond international standards. Employers are really in a very unfavorable position, and this has been acknowledged by the government quite some time ago already. This is also a big block for Indonesia in the competition with other ASEAN investment destinations. And Indonesia has passed to the parliament, the Indonesian government has passed to the parliament two so-called omnibus bills in early February. Omnibus bill means a law which changes a whole range of other laws. One is an omnibus bill concerning tax, which includes some tax facilitations. The other omnibus bill refers to a range of investment-related and business facilitating matters. It will include investment facilitations. It refers to a far range of issues like employment law and so on. And it also plans to ease regulations on employment law in Indonesia. So a termination of employment will likely be easier in the future. Maybe the severance payment will also be less comprehensive than it is at the moment. So far, it is unclear when this omnibus bill will pass Parliament. It's highly political, and long debate is going on about this. It is also not clear to what extent the current corona crisis might facilitate or accelerate this legislative development, but we see it from the other bill, from the tax bill, that some tax facilitation instruments have been put in place already. There are some VAT measures, there are some measures on personal income tax, which changes the tax base and ensures that certain income groups have more net salary in the end to mitigate their own economic losses under the crisis. This was also planned to be enacted later, but is in force already, which shows that the government seems to speed up, or also the parliament seems to speed up some of these instruments. As to employment law, we don't know yet whether and when acceleration might take place, but we keep it under surveillance.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the meantime, I've received many questions coming in the Zoom chat. So I would like to take this opportunity to also let you know that you will all be receiving the presentation and with also the contact details. So for more detailed questions, you would always be able to address the speakers individually. I may pick up one or two questions that came in. One was asking whether there is any support measures for businesses to help them navigate in these difficult times. I think the question may relate to financial support. And another question, to group it a little bit, was regarding the figures you have mentioned and also the maybe doubtful source, whether you have any idea of any other source where we can get reliable figures on the number of COVID deaths and what's really happening. There seems to be rumors of unrest in Jakarta and so on. So one is there anything in for businesses, any financial help? The other is, where can I get reliable information on what's really happening on the grounds in Indonesia?
Yeah, of course, that's very important issues. Unfortunately, there are no specific funds for businesses. It's not like in Europe where large subsidies are planned for companies to mitigate the situation. This is not planned in Indonesia. So it's not that companies get something, but they may give less. So there are tax regulations now planning reduction of corporate income tax for certain groups. Normally, it is linked to other investment support schemes. So companies that are already receiving investment facilitation in form of CIT reduction get further reductions now, but this is not broadly planned for all companies. Indonesia still has an eye on which company and which industrial sector has a specific importance for the industry and the economy or society as a whole. And these companies are rather facilitated than other companies which are deemed less important, unfortunately. So we unfortunately cannot report about significant instruments to financially support companies in Indonesia. Yeah, with regard to the figures, this is a very significant point of criticism in Indonesia. The government has so far acted quite intransparent. The official first case of COVID-19 was reported in early March, at a time when most other countries in the region already thought about lockdown, either partial or full, quarantine measures, and so on. The Indonesian government has reacted and responded quite sluggishly to the situation, I must say. And this is also seen by the population that the whole reaction came very, very late. The figures are ridiculously low, and of course, the actual figures are incredibly much higher. Unfortunately, the Indonesian health system does not allow any reliable data. So the Johns Hopkins University, for example, which normally provides figures in many countries, also has significant problems to compile reliable data here. So we do not have a clear picture. The normally cited source is indeed the Ministry of Health, which publishes the official figures coming from the tests that have been done so far in Indonesia. This is another problem. The test kits, the whole equipment for such COVID-19 tests is not very high, so there's not much testing going on so far in Indonesia. Otherwise, the figures would be significantly higher. And this is also a factor which makes people a bit concerned about how the situation develops and how bad it really is. And this is also why a lot of workers and employees in offices very strongly demand to work from home, because they simply feel safer to not go into public if it can be avoided. Regarding social unrest, we need to see how the situation will develop. We saw some partial issues here already. Right now, the situation is in general still quiet, but this can also change from week to week, and it is up to the government to transparently develop a plan how to steer through the situation, which so far is not clearly seen. There's quite some confusion among the population, also in Jakarta, regarding this partial lockdown, which now has been imposed. And this confusion certainly does not help to calm down the population.
All right, thank you very much. I think there's a couple of more questions which sometimes go a bit also into detail, and with regards to the time, I think we should pass on to the next country. I think it was a very nice summary also of the situation in Indonesia, which leads us now to Singapore, the situation in Singapore and the more specific employment and HR matters here. Thank you.
Thank you from my side.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Well, let me give you also first a brief update on the current situation in Singapore. Unfortunately, we saw an increase in numbers of confirmed cases recently in the past days, or actually weeks, which has led the government to announce a so-called circuit breaker, which is a lockdown technically. It includes restrictions on leaving place of residence. It means that closure of business premises, or also prohibition of social gatherings. The circuit breaker was announced by the Prime Minister the 3rd of April and was immediately put into legislation the 6th of April in the so-called COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act. And for now, the circuit breaker measures are in place from the 7th of April to the 4th of May, but they may be extended if the situation does not improve. The main piece of legislation is, besides the Act, the so-called COVID-19 Temporary Measures Control Order Regulation 2020, which for businesses means that all non-essential service providers must continue business from home. So that basically it says working from home, and if you can't do this, you must suspend your operation. The Ministry of Trade and Industry has put in place a website. It's a COVID.go business website, where you can basically see whether you are an essential service, and where you also get information on exemptions and notifications. Because if you are an essential service provider, I guess if that's the case, you would have done already, you would notify the authorities that you will continue with business also from your business premise. For non-essential service providers, there are 2 exemptions, one general exemption and one time limit exemption, which allows you to at least temporarily access your workplace. A general rule would be basically do not access your workplace when you do not have the approval from the authorities, not actually even to pick up mail. We see that the time limit exemption, this can be granted immediately. So once you've submitted, you get an electronic feedback. But keep in mind that you can only do this 4 times during the circuit breaker. For the general exemption, we saw, because some clients did the application, that this might take a while to get a response here. But in general, it means that most of us, as you can see here, are working from home, which leads me to the next slide, please. Can I do this? Okay. Working from home. I just want to, this is not an extensive list, but I just want to put in place some ideas, because it seems that not so many, there's not that much focus on what does it mean actually working from home. I guess a lot of companies might lack internal guidance or have not covered this in their employee handbook, and we think that there are a few points to consider. It's of course the availability of employees, thinking about working time, conduct and communication to be available, and how is it working. Then an IT-related matter is cybersecurity. When people are working from home, of course, they might use their, or very likely use their private networks. They might even use personal devices, and these can constitute threats to your cyber infrastructure. So you really need to ensure that cybersecurity is given. And I think there have been a few reported cases already in the past of cybersecurity threats. Another thing is, of course, data protection. Sorry, can you? Oh, yeah. Data protection. If your business is handling sensitive data or data which is protected under certain legislation, you of course need to adhere those rules also when working from home. And finally, confidentiality. If you have, as an employer, employment agreement in place which have confidentiality clauses, of course your employees need to comply with those clauses also when working from home. And when you have internal guidelines, it could even go down to the point, so where or how do you get rid of papers, of documents, in particular when those documents show business partner names, figures, or maybe even IP matters. Next slide, please. So since COVID-19 is not only, of course, a health crisis, but has also significant economic effects, we see that a lot of companies are considering to cut operation cost, and this in particular means labor cost. And the Ministry of Manpower, together with the union and the employer federation, they put in place the tripartite advisory on managing excess manpower and responsible retrenchment, which was issued at the 12th of March. As the title suggests, it's mainly about retrenchment, but retrenchment is considered as a last resort for companies. So they also cover a lot of other measures, which are, the tripartite advisory is, by the way, available online, so everyone can find this online. And in Annex A, you find a lot of guidance on the other measures. Just to briefly guide you through, for instance, if you want to adjust work arrangements without wage cuts, you may consider internal training or re-employment, meaning you ask your employees to work in other areas if possible. For work arrangements with wage cuts, you can introduce part-time work or shorten work weeks with salary cuts. Then, of course, there is a direct adjustment of wages, which might constitute in a cutting of bonus payments or variable components of salary. And finally, there is the no-pay leave. All those measures have to be implemented properly. That means you should notify the employees. You need the consent of the union if you're unionized as a company. If not, you need the consent of your individual employee if you want to implement those measures. And for the circuit breaker, the MOM, so Ministry of Manpower, also introduced a mandatory notification which applies when you're an employer with more than 10 or at least 10 employees, and consider cost-saving measures with significant amounts, like as I mentioned in the slide, 25%, depending. There are differences with local and foreign employees. Next slide, please. However, maybe you don't need to go that far since the Singapore government has already reacted to the COVID-19 crisis. It was already addressed in the initial budget 2020, which was announced in February. And we saw already two supplement budgets. One is called the Resilient Budget from the 26th of March, and the other one, the Solidarity Budget, just passed last week together with the circuit breaker, the 6th of April. And altogether, Singapore will or has planned 55 billion Singapore dollars of COVID-19 related measures to help businesses, workers, and households. Since we are talking here about HR, so I want to focus on, I think, the most significant scheme, that is a job support scheme. It's basically a co-funding for wages of local employees, which means local employees are Singapore citizens or people with a permanent residency in Singapore. The co-funding will apply from October 2019 to July 2020. And initially, it was planned to come in certain tranches and certain levels. So certain sectors, for instance, the aviation industry would be supported with 75% of the first 4,600 Singapore dollars of gross monthly salary, and other sectors with 50% and the rest with 25%. But during the circuit breaker, also it was announced in the Solidarity Budget, they will actually support now all employees, local employees, with 75% on this first 4,600 Singapore dollars of gross monthly salary. And the payouts are in April, July, and October this year. And as you could see yesterday in the news, payout happened partly yesterday. So 140,000 employers, they have received job support scheme, like money, to cover wages of 1.9 million employees. There's no application required, but eligible companies or qualified companies will be notified by IRAS, by the Inland Revenue Authority. Other schemes which might be worth mentioning is the wage credit scheme, which is an older scheme and which supports the increase of salaries. Another one that was also announced in the Solidarity Budget is the waiver of monthly foreign worker levy for April 2020. Next slide, please. If those measures are not going far enough, of course, companies can also consider to adjust their manpower, their workforce here in Singapore. I want to show that there are 2 points to it. First, of course, you can adjust hiring practice. I guess many of our participants have already done this. Is it a general hiring freeze or requirement headquarter approval for any new job advertisement? If you have already signed employment agreements, but they have not yet commenced, you might consider to defer those. So for instance, you have signed an agreement in January, but the commencement is planned in May. You may consider, if economically reasonable, to defer the commencement date to a later point in time. Another one is for already existing employees who are under probation period. You might extend those probation periods, if it's possible in Singapore, just by a letter. Finally, we come to the adjustment of existing workforce. As mentioned earlier in the Tripartite Advisory, retrenchment is the last resort. And of course, the advisory is trying to give alternatives, but if those alternatives are not working for you, you must first, when you do the exercise of retrenchment, select your employees on a fair and objective, or based on fair and objective criteria. You must comply with certain notification requirements. You need, of course, to notify the respective employees. You must consider the notice periods, and the advisory is actually suggesting to may use longer periods even than considered in the contracts. And you might need to consider retrenchment benefits. Retrenchment means normally that you terminate not just one, but several employments, and maybe whole teams, departments. So this is a major exercise and needs to be separate from a single termination. Let's say you have a smaller unit and you feel like that certain adjustments are made, you might also just consider a normal termination with termination notice or termination agreement, whatever is more suitable in the moment. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, I also would like to cover briefly foreign workforce. I think sorry, there was a change in slide. There was already mentioned bringing in for work pass holders to Singapore and also their dependents is rather restrictive. I guess that applies to many countries now. There are a lot of entry restrictions. Employers are urged from the Ministry of Manpower to defer all intended arrivals of work pass holders and their dependents. They need to request an entry approval from the ministry. And if that's also not always the case, if you get the approval, you then need to, of course, comply with certain stay-home notice or quarantine orders. For new foreign work pass holders, first of all, if you consider now to apply for instance, an employment pass, the chances are very small that you get it. So the application, there are limited spots only. The Ministry of Manpower is suggesting that you might, if you want to hire a foreigner, that you hire foreigners who are already in Singapore. And assuming that, let's say, you have already hired someone and you received the so-called in principle approval, basically the person is overseas and the Ministry of Manpower has approved the employment pass application, then this person has to issue the pass in a certain time. You should maybe consider to extend this time because at the moment this person might not be able to enter Singapore within the given time frame. This is more or less the part for me. I would like to come to some final remarks, which are not only applying to the foreign workforce, but maybe more on a general basis applying to Singapore. I mean, I guess the situation, as we can all agree, is very dynamic, and so is also the changes in the legal framework. So whenever you make HR decisions, you should ensure that it's on the latest set of rules. So there are a lot of information available, a lot of might be outdated. So ensure that you always make your decision on the latest set of rules. Sometimes rules might be not clear, or responses from authorities might not be clear. For instance, am I an essential service provider, or can I approach or go to my workplace? Thinking maybe even ahead after the circuit breaker, how do I implement maybe certain hygiene rules? You always, if you don't get feedback from the authorities, which at this moment in time is very difficult because you can imagine they get a lot of requests for implementation of certain rules. If you don't get it, and you must act immediately, you must make a decision, make the decision based in a way the spirit of the rules. So I would suggest a more conservative view here. Social distancing and or staying at home is, I guess, more advisable. If you come, if it's necessary that you make cuts, wage cuts, or changes to your workforce, you must ensure that you communicate them clearly and that you have them in a proper documentation. And finally, of course, you should always consider mid and long term. employments or developments when it comes to your workforce, not only operational costs, think also about scarcity of talents, team spirit and motivation. Thank you very much, and I look forward for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Ladies and gentlemen, again, your opportunity to ask questions through the webinar chat. We have heard that Singapore has already enacted quite a number of measures to support its business community. One question that came up in this context was whether the job support scheme that you mentioned, Christian, which basically helps businesses to pay the salary of their local staff or reimburses some of the salary of local staff, whether this job support scheme would be available for all businesses in Singapore?
Well, if you are a registered business and a registered enterprise in Singapore, it might very well apply. There is, however, there is an employer exclusion list available on the IRAS website. Basically, you can see whether you are entitled to and qualified to get the job support scheme payments. For instance, if you are an unregistered local or foreign entity, you might not qualify for it. Or if you're an entity which even pays CPF payments, but you're not registered in Singapore, you might also not be qualified for it. In general, it's quite following objective rules, but if, let's say, you do not get the notification by IRAS, you should, of course, now check whether you have those notifications. You should communicate then clearly with IRAS, and if you feel that it's unjust that you have not received any notification, you could consider an appeal.
All right, we have one more very practical question. How do I calculate retrenchment benefits?
Well, the Ministry of Manpower offers some guidance here. So first of all, retrenchment benefits are covered under the Employment Act, but are actually only applying to certain employees, so-called Part 4 of the Employment Act employees, so with a lower salary. However, the Ministry of Manpower and also now in the tripartite advisory suggests that or gives some numbers. So basically the idea is half of a month to 1 month's salary per year of service is something to consider. But again, there is no fixed legal requirement for a certain amount, but you should consider, let's say you do not pay retrenchment benefits or you pay less than those suggested numbers, and there is a dispute, the court might very well follow the general guidance of the Ministry of Manpower when it comes to retrenchment benefits.
All right, I may take one last question. One person was asking, what can I do as an employer if I need to put cost-cutting measures into place, but my employees are not agreeable? I think in your presentation, you referred to the potential necessary consent of unions and the consent of the employees. So what do I do if they do not consent to the proposed measures?
Well, first of all, of course, I guess as in many aspects in life, it's a matter of how do you communicate this to your employees. I guess transparency and explaining the business situation is key to really make them understand that this is a necessary step. I guess creating team spirit, that we are all in the same boat basically, or also lead by by example for the management, would help to create understanding that certain measures must put in place, maybe just temporarily. If, of course, then the particular employee is not agreeable to it, it comes down to a very clear business decision. Either you want to keep this employee to the existing terms, or you might need to terminate the employment because you will not be able to unilaterally change the salary.
Okay, thank you very much. I think with regard to the time, we should move on to the next country. And I would like to pass the word to Martin from Thailand.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. let's talk a little bit about Thailand and the implications of COVID-19 on Thailand. So as of today, we have around about 2,670 confirmed cases, and I think 46 people have died as of today. Keep in mind, testing in Thailand, testing capacities are rather limited if you compare it to other countries, so the actual number of cases are likely much higher. In fact, yesterday I talked to a friend of mine, and they have a bunch of, she's a doctor, and they have a bunch of cases in the hospital with respiratory syndromes, but they haven't been tested for COVID-19, and therefore it's not considered a case of COVID-19. But overall, over the last week, we saw a slight decrease of new cases. So there might be a slight light at the end of the tunnel after all. However, the economic impacts will be very severe for Thailand. Just today or yesterday, the IMF has calculated that the economy in Thailand will shrink by about 7% or so in 2020. So that's obviously quite concerning. From my point of view, there are three major pieces of legislation that you want to distinguish here. So number one is the Communicable Disease Act. Number two are the various shutdown orders that have been issued. And number three is the emergency decree that has been invoked and the subsequent announcements under such emergency decree. So on March 1st, COVID-19 was designated as a dangerous communicable disease in Thailand. So that allows the authorities, the health authorities, to issue certain orders. For instance, they can issue persons to take medical exams or to go into quarantine, stuff like that. They can order owners and occupiers of premises to disinfect the premises or to close down premises. They can even order destruction of certain items if necessary. So that's important. Also, they designated certain countries as high-risk countries or countries with ongoing transmissions, and that was relevant in terms of immigration. However, as of now, seems to be that it's superseded to a degree by the regulations under the emergency decree. So then we have the Communicable Disease Act, then we have the various shutdown orders. The shutdown orders in Thailand are issued by the governors of the provinces, so you have a bunch of shutdown orders, a big variety, and most of them are valid until 30 April, as far as I know. And in general, they close down venues attracting crowds, educational facilities, entertainment venues, malls, restaurants, stuff like that. And however, you have to look into each individual shutdown order to figure out whether or not you are affected by it in any way. And actually by now, the shutdown orders are legally in the rank of the emergency decree, because the emergency decree, they sort of incorporated the various shutdown orders. So yeah, and on 25th March, I think, the Prime Minister has invoked a nationwide emergency. And what this does is this allows the government to basically take any measure necessary to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in Thailand. And subsequently, they have issued two announcements, regulations under the emergency decree. And in the announcement number one, they actually banned entry of foreigners to Thailand. That was one big point. Furthermore, they banned public gatherings, though nobody really knows what public gatherings means. How many people is public, big public gathering. They prohibited the distribution of false information on COVID-19 because there have been a bunch of weird information on Facebook and so forth. They also prohibited hoarding of goods such as medical supplies, food, etc. So that was quite important. They also issued a bunch of preventive measures that should be taken by companies that will be later relevant when we talk about workplace safety. Then they issued another announcement which contained a curfew. So that's actually quite relevant. So as of today, from 10 o'clock at night to 4 in the morning, you are restricted to stay at home. It is relevant if you are employing people who have to work in a night shift. So we're going to see what the impacts of these are later on. Next slide, please. Yeah, let's briefly talk about immigration. So as I said, foreigners are, as of today, banned from entering Thailand. This has been implemented by land, air, and sea. The Civil Aviation Authority of Thailand has subsequently issued a ban for all planes landing in Thailand, unless for emergency and the applicable exceptions. And actually just yesterday, the ban has been extended until 30th of April. So it's going to be like that for the duration of April at least. Exceptions apply to pilots, shippers, and truck drivers. If you bring in goods and if you have a clear schedule to get out of Thailand again. To diplomats and representatives of international organizations, if you get a special permission by the government, obviously. And also that's relevant for many companies, holders of work permits. So they are in general allowed to enter Thailand. There have been a little bit confusion on the subject, but overall it seems to be right now that any holder of a work permit can enter Thailand. However, in any case, you have to provide a certificate that you are healthy, that you haven't contracted COVID-19, and this certificate has to be issued 72 hours prior to departure of the flight. I think from a practical point of view, this is just very difficult to obtain. Furthermore, you have to have an insurance of at least $100,000 US. And when you arrive in Thailand, you have to go to 14-day quarantine. And actually the government says that it is state supervised quarantine. However, I know cases in my field, and they were ordered to self-quarantine at home for 14 days. So I'm not quite sure actually how they are implementing this quarantine right now. So that is relevant. Furthermore, you have to download a certain app at the airport and you have to fill in a bunch of forms or the necessary bureaucracy. And if you have foreign staff coming back to Thailand, expats, you want to make sure that they have the right documentation. For Thais, it's also difficult. They need to provide a special letter from the embassy that they want to come back to Thailand. Again, for foreigners, Thailand has issued a sort of visa amnesty right now. So all visas expiring after the invocation of the emergency, 26th March, they are automatically extended until 30th of April. They have also waived all overstay fines. And for person holding a long stay visa in Thailand, they have waived the requirement to do 90-day reporting. So that's actually quite nice. Because there was a little bit of bad press. There were huge queues at immigration. Actually, lots of tourists got stuck in Thailand and they couldn't leave because there are literally no flights out of Thailand. So that helped them quite a bit. But this is also quite relevant for your foreign workforce in Thailand, obviously. That's a major part of immigration. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about this one, yeah. The most relevant HR measures. I want to talk briefly about force majeure. This has been thrown around the term quite a bit. And what cases does it apply to, maybe? Then do we have anything similar to German short-term work in Thailand? What can you agree on with your employees? Is there anything you can do with annual leave? What about home office? And then let's briefly talk about termination pitfalls. Next slide. Yeah, so force majeure. Force majeure is defined in the Thai Civil and Commercial Code as an event, an outside event that could not have been prevented, even though all necessary precautions have been taken. In a nutshell, this usually applies to natural disasters and other uncontrollable events. Think about the floods in Thailand, think about the riots that we had in Thailand. So what happens if you invoke force majeure, then you're basically freed from your contractual obligations. So that is relevant in terms of the duty to perform work as an employee and the duty to pay wages. So keep in mind, there hasn't been any case law on the subject. So this is all the current consensus of lawyers. So you have to, before you invoke force majeure, you want to really talk to a lawyer first and make sure that, that this actually applies in your case. In general consensus seems to be that there could be two cases of force majeure. If your company is subject to a closure order, if you're either by a shutdown order or by an order under the Communicable Disease Act, if you're forced to shut down, this would be considered an outside event, unpreventable for you, and then you're probably freed of the obligation to pay wages. And the same applies if your employee receives a quarantine order. In this case, the employee would likely be entitled to a compensation by the government, and the employer does not have to pay salary for this time. Compensation is rather limited, actually. I think maximum is 15,000 Thai baht. Again, it's a case-by-case basis determination, and the interpretation of force majeure is quite complicated, and this should not just be willy-nilly invoked. So I discussed with our lawyers a little bit what are definitely not cases of force majeure. It is if you close down your business as a precaution, right, as a health precaution, or if you order home office, or if you order reduced working hours, all of which does not constitute force majeure because you have control over all these measures, and therefore the obligation to pay salary in full remains in full force. So force majeure, difficult and only likely in cases of closure of business orders or quarantine of employees. That's the takeaway. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, reduction of wages, obviously cutting costs, that's quite important. We have not, as I said before, we don't have something like short-term work as we know it in Germany, but we have something similar under Section 75 of the Labor Protection Act. If you have to cease business operations partially or entirely because of an event that does not constitute force majeure in it for itself, but sort of forces you to go out of business for a certain period of time. In this case, you would be entitled to reduce wages of employees by 25%, so to 75%. And this does not require the consent of the employees. However, again, this provision is also tricky. So not quite sure if the current ongoing crisis constitute necessary and significant reason. If you look in the case law, what is usually acceptable, it's something like a major drop in purchase orders and other financial difficulties arising from this. So basically, if you're forced to close down your business or else your business as a whole is threatened in its very existence, then you could be entitled to cutting wages in accordance with this provision. In any case, you will have to inform the labor inspector and the employees in writing of this in advance, 3 days, that is. So again, this is also a tricky measure and should be carefully reviewed before or prior to implementation to make sure that you don't open yourself up to claims later on. The safest way forward from my point of view is agreeing with employees on a wage reduction. This is generally possible. You just have to make sure that you comply, that the agreement is very specific and that it complies with the clauses in the employment agreement. You might have special amendment clauses. You want to look that up. And the agreement should clearly stipulate that you reduce working hours and that you reduce the salary accordingly, right? Let's say you cut down from 5 days to 4 days, that would be like 20% or something like that. Then you would reduce the salary accordingly. You should also fix the duration of the reduction. So make sure that you say, okay, during the month of April or May or something like that. Then the employee, that's very important, has to consent freely to the wage reduction. Otherwise, it's invalid. So make sure that you don't attach a threat to it. Like you sign this or else. This could likely be challenged in court. And obviously, you want to need the employee's signature under this. But in general, a simple letter prescribing all these various aspects and having this employee sign it and agreeing to it would be sufficient. In our experience, many employees were actually willing to sign, to agree to certain wage reductions against the against a certain guarantee that the job will be retained. So that's, I guess, the best way to do it. Okay, next slide, please. So what else can you do? Can you order annual leave? So that's actually sort of a little bit of a tricky question. In general, the Labor Protection Act says that the employer has to fix annual leave in advance for the employees, so it could be possible. However, in practice, many employment agreements or company rules stipulate otherwise. So you want to make sure that you comply with your employment agreement. If you have a company rule that says that the employee requests annual leave and then the superior has to approve it, then you can likely not just fix it for your employee. So then you would have to discuss with the employee whether or not they're willing to take annual leave anyways. But that would be a possibility that you want to look into. Home office. So employees are not entitled to home office, and ordering home office does not reduce pay at all, unless the employee agrees to it. Again, consent required. In fact, home office only changes the location where the work is performed, and all other duties remain in full force, like working time and general duties. However, certain aspects like workplace safety do obviously not apply, right? You cannot, employer is not required to disinfect the home of an employee because he's working from home. Yeah, and obviously you want to make sure that your employee has sufficient equipment, laptop, and so forth if they're required to work from home. If they cannot perform their work from home, then obviously they cannot, this would not work, and they are not legally obliged to comply with an order like that then. So that's for home office. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if worse comes to worse, you want to consider termination for redundancy. General rules apply. You are obliged to pay a severance payment to your employee. If you terminate without notice period, then you have to make the payment in lieu of notice. Outstanding annual leave has to be paid out. So that's the normal rules. However, termination for redundancy are quite complicated because employees can claim unfair termination damages in Thailand. So under an unfair termination claim, the law does not prescribe the amount of damages. However, by rule of thumb, you could say an employee is usually awarded 1 monthly salary per year of employment with a company. So if you want to prepare this, you want to make sure that you have a fair reason to terminate the employee, and just a drop in revenue, your company is less profitable. This does not constitute a fair reason to terminate the employee because it's just less profitable. However, if you're experiencing consistent losses and the business in a whole is threatened and the termination is therefore necessary, this could be considered a fair reason. So if you have a situation like that on your hand, you want to make sure that you have objective criteria which you use to select employees to be laid off. So what you want to do is you make a spreadsheet with the employees on it, and you issue all the various criteria such as work performance, seniority, attendance, had there been any issues in the past, what is the current salary, and so forth. And then you use the spreadsheet to figure out what employees to terminate and what not. Again, this is also very tricky and should be carefully prepared, and there are lots of mistakes that can be made. And ideally, you will settle with employees anyways. So they would sign a settlement agreement, so they would be entitled to a compensation. Ideally, they would resign, but in practice, this is very likely that they're not going to go for that. But settlement agreements are generally the best way forward to do this, to make sure that you're not facing unfair termination claims later on. Yeah, that's basically it for unfair termination. So go to the next slide. Yeah, other matters relating to the employee. If an employee contracts COVID-19, then they're entitled to sick leave. In Thailand, that's 30 days of paid sick leave, and subsequently unpaid sick leave, as many as they want to. If they are under quarantine order, we touched on that previously, then the general consensus right now is that there's no obligation to pay wages to an employee under quarantine order. And the employee in turn is entitled to a compensation by the government. So that's an important point. Yeah, as I told before, we have a curfew in place from 10 in the evening to 4 in the morning. And some employees have to work during curfew time, during night shift, right? And in order to be allowed to be outside of your house, you need a special permission granted by the competent district office, that is. However, getting this permission it takes quite some time right now. So pending the permission, we are advised, companies are advised to issue a letter to the employee that bears the name of the employee, the address, the workplace address, the position in the company and the time of the shift, so that they have something to show to any police officer or whoever is enforcing the curfew, actually, allowing them to be outside then. So that would be important. For workplace safety, there have been under the first announcement of the emergency decree, they have described certain measures to implement to prevent the spread of COVID-19 further. And there's also a regulation issued by the Ministry of Public Health. They're very alike, actually. So basically what you want to do is you want to make sure that you clean a workplace regularly, that you dispose any waste regularly. Ideally, you have some evidence that somebody did the job and signed it. You want to provide surgical masks to your employee if you have any, and especially if they have contact with customers and so forth. You want to provide disinfecting materials or other facilities where they can wash their hands regularly. If you have many employees, you might even consider setting up a checkpoint to check for fevers and stuff like that. You want to inform your employees on the effects of COVID-19 and the related symptoms. And ideally, you have an entire policy would be good, just that you can show to any authority if you ever asked. Something to keep in mind here is none of these advices are actually carrying a penalty to it. So if you're not complying with this, you will not be fined or anything. However, if your employee maybe contracts COVID-19 otherwise, they could, in theory, hold the employer liable under wrongful act. So that's something to consider. So you want to make sure that you're complying with this to protect yourself. The only duty that has penalty affixed to this is the duty to report to the authorities if any employee has contracted COVID-19 or is suspected of having contracted COVID-19. And if you don't notify the authorities on time, then you might face a penalty of up to 20,000 Thai baht, I think it is. So you want to avoid that. Yeah, so that's basically it for workplace safety. So we can go to the next slide. Relevant relief measures with regards to human resources and employment. So for the period of March to May, the social security contribution rate for employers and employees have been reduced. For employers down to 4% and for employees down to 1%. So you have to pay less social security contributions. So it's not very significant. And furthermore, if an employee, if they are ordered to quarantine, they are entitled to a compensation. And they are also entitled to compensation in case of terminations or if they resign due to the ongoing crisis. So this is relevant when it comes to social security. For tax, I think the most important part is that you can deduct salaries of up to 15,000 at the rate of 300% during the period of April to July 2020. However, that is only permissible if the employee is registered under the social security system and the number of overall insured employees during this period is not lower than it was as of 31st December 2019. So this measure basically aims at ensuring and retaining employment for low-earning employees. And it is our understanding that it's only salaries that are maximum Thai baht 15,000 are eligible. So if someone earning Thai baht 16,000, you cannot deduct it as far as we understand it. Also not just by reducing it to 15,000. Because it mainly aims at retaining these jobs. Then another important measure would be reduction of withholding taxes for certain payments from 3 to 1.5%, mainly hire of work and other services. Here again, the main goal is to ensure cash flow and make sure that the company can survive the crisis. Many other measures are actually in place and many other programs have been enacted. So there's a lot to look into. But I think been going on for quite a while now. I think for HR-wise, these are the most important parts of it. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you very much, Martin. There was really a whole lot of information to digest and for sure very interesting to our participants. However, I have heard that some participants may have difficulties to access the webinar chat. Don't worry, you will have opportunities to ask your questions later. You will get the presentation, as I said before, and also the contact details, so your questions will not be lost. However, I do have a question. You have actually already, I think, briefly touched about workplace safety, but there was a question, what do I do if one of my employees has been contracted with COVID-19? Do I have to close down?
Yeah, we get this question quite a bit. So the general consensus is no. As of now, there is no regulation in place that would force you to close down. However, this could be slightly different if you have like a whole cluster of cases. Then in this case, we deem it likely that the relevant authorities would issue an order to close down at least the section of the business for the time being. However, there's no, right now, if your employee contracts COVID-19, the only thing you really have to do is to notify the public health authorities, and you want to obviously notify all the other employees, and they might then go for self-isolation or something like that. But you don't have to close down the operation as of now, no.
All right, there's one more question that I can take. Then I think I unfortunately have to stop the Q&A session here. The question was relating to, again, relief measures. Are there any relief measures available pertaining to rental costs of the workplace? Others were also talking about company cars. So maybe if you can summarize this, is there any relief measures in place when it comes to cost for employees?
This is actually a tricky one. I know that this has been in discussion, but I'm not quite sure if this has already been enacted. For now, the measures that have been enacted, they all relate to taxation, so filing of taxes and other things have been, the periods have been extended. I'm not quite sure if there's any special deductions for rental and stuff like this. Maybe you can send me an email. I will look into this again if they have enacted anything already. It is being discussed. I know that much.
Right. Thank you very much, Martin. I think with regards to the time, we definitely should pass on to the next country, to Vietnam. And Martin, another Martin, will give us more input here. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone from Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. Giving you kind of, after all what we heard from the other countries, trying to give you a wrap up of Vietnam. First of all, what is the current status? We have currently confirmed 267 cases, which is, I think, compared to the other countries, quite low. And the number, as far as I got told, is quite reliable. I think this is due to a fact that Vietnam really took care of the coronavirus as it started end of January and took measures there. So yes, I think the number is quite reliable. Anyway, since 1st of April 2020, also Vietnam is kind of under a lockdown. What does this mean? We call it actually social distancing measures. Mostly this means in public people have to wear face masks. You only can go out if really necessary, meaning to supermarkets and to the doctor. Anyway, if you look out of the window here in Ho Chi Minh City, you can see a lot of motorbikes, of course, much less than usual, but the life is still going on. Very interesting also, I mean, people on the streets, they of course wear the face masks and they on their own, they really take care of these measures and they understand those measures. I think also quite interesting is that actually also under those social distancing measures, this does not mean that all factories had to close down. So actually factories are open. but especially in the service industry, and of course schools and kindergartens, they're all closed. In service industries, only necessary services, which is, for example, bank, logistics, and law firm, they can still remain open. This also means that I am here talking. I think I have the advantage of talking to you from our office. Anyway, I mean, people are a bit unsure because under those social distancing measures, there is, for example, the regulation that not more than 20 people shall be together in a room. So here there's some uncertainty how to deal with this. We, for example, said, okay, we only have part of our staff here in the office to have those social distancing measures at least regarded in a certain way. As of yesterday, we have also a new measure, because these measures from 1st of April, they should take place only until 15 April. So everyone was kind of really keen on what's happening next, what is going on. And well, as nearly have been foreseen, they have extended those social distancing measures as for now until 22 of April. But one change is there, not nationwide as it was before. It was limited or reduced to 12 cities and provinces, under which are Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, and Da Nang. So this means, well, if we consider those biggest cities of Vietnam, that this means finally there is no much change in practice. Coming just for the current status, coming also a little bit touching immigration. There is the decision or the directive here in Vietnam that no visa shall be issued anymore. This is actually in place since several weeks, I think 3 or 4 weeks already, which means that, yeah, of course, you can't get any new visa. This is, of course, different to foreigners staying here in Vietnam. They are taken care of. But also here we have certain problems, because for working permits and temporary residence cards, for people not having that yet, there are problems with issuing them, because as far as I know, until now they will not issue new ones. In fact, actually, those immigration measures, I think, have a bigger practical influence, because all flights are banned since beginning of April too. So actually you can't come to Vietnam through plane and also you can't fly away. So in practice, the thing is that until further notice, we don't know when this will change. We are just, I think, as most of all other countries, kind of a bit detached from the rest. Coming now to HR issues. In this slide, you can see, I tried to put it a bit from another perspective. As we already heard, through agreement, I think you can resolve many problems with the employee. I have listed here certain measures that are in general possible under Vietnam laws. And one is, of course, termination of labor contract, suspension. Yeah, and when we talk about suspension, please take care. There is a suspension of work, and there is some kind of suspension of implementation of labor contract. What is the difference here? Suspension of work means the labor relationship still remains in place, and the employee just doesn't come to work. I will get to back that a bit later. If we talk about suspension of implementation of labor contract, this means actually that for a certain time, the labor relationship, meaning the labor contract, is suspended and will kind of get back in force after a certain agreed period. Then we have, of course, also possibility is unpaid leave or reduction of working hours. It's just a matter of perspective. But all those measures, actually, I will come to the unilateral possibilities and options a bit later. But all those options, please take away as for now, is should be agreed with the employee, which is, as we already heard, sometimes not so easy. If you're talking about other options, we have a temporary job transfer possibility. So if this would be more an option if in one workplace here in Vietnam, you just don't have any work, but in the other factory, you might have a lot of work to do, then there is an option for temporary job transfer, but maximum 60 days without agreement. Seeing from another perspective, from another angle, this means for maximum 60 days, you have in Vietnam the possibility of unilateral transfer of the employee. Late payment is possible, late payment of the salary up to 1 month and up to 15 days without payment of interest. So if you are really in big trouble with your factory in Vietnam, there is this option, but I think it's not a real relief because after 15 or maximum 30 days, this problem comes back again. Next slide, please. Touching home office, we talked a lot about home office. I mean, no big difference in Vietnam, but maybe as kind of a conclusion here for Vietnam, if there is home office, be it ordered by you as an employer, or be it ordered through some quarantine decision of the authorities, as you might know, as soon as here in Vietnam, they discover one coronavirus case, they're gonna lock down the whole building for sure, maybe even some districts, even just because of one case. So in all those cases, takeaway should be, it is up to the employer to decide about that, meaning the employee can't say, well, I can't come to the office, so I don't have to work. So if you decide that there shall be home office, then the employee shall comply. I think this is for home office the most important point here. Next slide, please. Starting with the toughest measure, unilateral termination. Important or interesting, you can put it in Vietnam, is that due to this directive, which I already mentioned, which was issued beginning of April for the social distancing measures, due to this directive, according to labor law, this is considered as a force majeure case. So this gives you this decision, which is still in place even after 15th of April, this is our understanding. You have a reason to unilaterally terminate in Vietnam the labor contract. Nevertheless, please don't forget, this is kind of last resort. It doesn't mean just because of this directive you can terminate each and every one you wish to terminate. You still have to establish that this is the last resort and there is no other option. Furthermore, the other procedures of unilateral termination also apply, meaning, for example, the 45 days of a notification term for indefinite term labor contract and 30 days for definite term labor contract. So in practice, I think this is, if you need some short measures to take in this crisis, I don't think this is the real option. But anyway, as a takeaway, you have the option, which is under Vietnamese labor laws not so easy actually to terminate unilaterally. This is at least a reason to terminate. Next slide, please. Talking about work suspension, this is, if we talk about unilateral possibilities, also coming back to this directive. Due to this directive, actually, unilaterally, you have an option for work suspension. But once again, please don't get confused here. We have work suspension and suspension of implementation of the labor contract. And this suspension of the implementation of the whole contract is just due to agreement. We don't have the time to go into this here due to the time limit. But this is just due to agreement. Talking about work suspension, here the good news is, yes, you can do unilaterally. You can decide and say, hey, anyway, the factory is closed, home office is not possible. So let's talk about suspension, or you can also order suspension. But, and here is the bad news for the employer, for changing of the salary, you need the agreement of the employee anyway. There is still another but, which means even if you can agree on changing, amending the salary, the regional minimum salary must be applied, which is for Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi around about 4.4 million dong, which is around, should be 23,000 is the exchange rate, something like, correct me if I'm wrong, 130, 150 US dollar. In practice, this is what I got told, and this is what we also see in our consulting. Anyway, even if you need this agreement of the employee, most often they agree on this because they can see there is no other option, and still there is this minimum salary which applies. So, next slide, please. This is as for Vietnam, actually in very short, the options that we are having. Once again, to sum it up, if you need to terminate labor relationships or find other ways of suspending an employee, you're quite limited without the agreement. And maybe as a last remark, the social insurance, health insurance, and unemployment insurance, there is no real option to trigger those unless, of course, the employee is tested positive for coronavirus, then health insurance, of course, applies. And in case of unilateral termination, unemployment insurance applies, but there is no other option that you can use, for example, during suspension, the social insurance regime. This is from my side as for now, in short.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for being so much to the point to help us to be able to close this webinar on time. I may take one more question. It possibly comes from one of the participants in Germany. A lot of German participants from German headquarters log onto this webinar as well. And the question was whether we have something comparable to Kurzarbeit in Vietnam. I mean, maybe for those who are not so familiar with the concept, Kurzarbeit is basically a scheme where employees work less or even up to almost no time and have a reduced salary, but the social security system, the so-called unemployment insurance, would actually cover some or most of the salary cost.
Well, finally, unfortunately, no. I mean, we have talked about the options we're having, and I couldn't touch the unpaid leave, reduction of working hours, which was in one of my first slides, which basically would mean you can, of course, reduce the work until, let's say, 0, or let's put it on 10 hours instead of 40. But all this is subject to agreement. And even then, there is unfortunately not the social insurance regime that comes in, especially in case of suspension. As mentioned, you have to pay at least the minimum salary, the local. So no, unfortunately, even if there is a social insurance regime, it can't apply, or you can't use it for this crisis right now.
All right, thank you. I think I have to close the Q&A session with regards to the time, and we'll pass on to Bettina for the closing remarks of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to all of my colleagues who joined this webinar. And thank you all our guests for joining and for participating in today's session. Of course, our entire team will be at your disposal for any further questions you might have. Sorry for the shutdown of the chat option, which happened under the webinar. We managed to settle these technical difficulties, but should you have any questions left, please do feel free to just drop me an email and I will liaise with whomever you would like to talk to. Let me take this option to draw your attention to our special article series, COVID-19. on our company website. There you will find current updates on the global developments with regard to Corona and its impact on business and economy all the time. We are making an effort to keep it updated on a almost daily basis. So thank you all very much for attending, and stay safe and have a nice weekend ahead. Bye.